This video is sponsored by Motion VFX.
Christmas, it's the best time of the year. I don't know if there'll be snow, but have a cup of cheer. Jolly Christmas, and when you walk down the street.
This little short was filmed with the new Laowa Nanomorph Anamorphic Lenses. They sport a 1.5x squeeze ratio, a constant T2.9 aperture, and are designed to fit larger than full-frame sensors. I've been shooting with these lenses for a few weeks now, and I'll say off the top that I was surprised how much I enjoyed shooting with them. I also think they fit very nicely into the current ecosystem of affordable anamorphic lenses on the market these days. But like all anamorphics, they have some quirks that you probably want to be aware of. So the goal of today's video is to show you some example footage, talk about some of those unique characteristics of these lenses, and hopefully help you decide whether these are a good fit for what you might be looking for. Let's get into it. Okay, so a quick disclaimer. Laowa did send me these lenses on loan to test out, but they didn't pay me, and as always, they have no say in what I say, and they don't get to see this video before you do. The Laowa Nanomorphs come in 4 focal length options: 32, 42, 55, and 85. I personally borrowed the 42 and 55, but they seem to have performed pretty much the same as far as I could tell, so I think you can feel confident in this assessment if you're interested in the 85 or the 32 instead. The construction of these lenses is very sturdy and premium. Basically, everything is made from a very high quality metal. They give some heft to them and some weight, but not so much that they seem overly cumbersome. They're definitely bigger than something like the Blazar Remus, but much lighter than other higher-end anamorphics. So they work nicely with smaller cinema cameras. So if you're using the FX3 or the S5 2X, I think you'd be totally fine. If you've ever used the Sirui Venus lenses, they're roughly the same size as those. It also might be worth noting that the 32 is the largest of the set, while the 85 is the smallest. Different than most anamorphics, but they're all within around 100 grams of one another. They have a 77mm filter thread and then an 80mm front diameter and a 270-degree focus throw that's really nice and balanced. It has some nice resistance to it, but you can certainly still focus these by hand if you're going really run and gun. I personally was using the Focus Pro for this little concept that Jonny and I worked on together. By default, these lenses come in PL mount, which is great for adaptability. And if I was to pick a cine lens, I would probably go with PL just to know that my bases are covered. But one unique thing about these lenses is Laowa has also added an option to swap out the lens mount for EF, RF, Sony E mount, L mount, and Z mount. So you just have this little extra mount here that you can literally swap out with the PL mount. It does require a bit of Frankensteining to remove the PL mount and replace it with your desired mount, but it is really awesome to have this option if you know that you're going to be shooting on one mount pretty consistently. Another thing you can customize is the lens flares. They have a blue, amber, and silver option, and for me, whenever I have the option, I like to go with silver since it takes on the color of whatever light source is causing the flare. I also mentioned off the top that these are designed to fit larger than full-frame sensors. Specifically, they were designed to fit the ARRI Alexa LF in 4.5K open gate or the Red V-Raptor 8K VV. And while I don't have any of those lying around, it did great on full-frame sensors of the FX3 and FX6, which is what we were filming on. And by the way, if you want some of the sound effects that were used in that video, I'll link to a Whoosh sound effects pack in the description. It is completely free to download, but you can say thank you by hitting the subscribe button. And hey, did you see that nice little fancy subscribe graphic there? That was actually really easy to create using the MTuber 4 plugin from Motion VFX. Motion VFX has been a longtime sponsor of the channel, but before that, I've been using them for ages for all of my animated text, callouts, graphics, and I'm very hyped about this new MTuber 4 pack, which gives you just about everything you need to add some spice to a YouTube video. You can animate a logo, create an intro sequence, create custom callouts or countdowns like this, and of course, they've got all of the social media interactions that you might need, like highlighting a comment or prompting viewers to subscribe, you name it. If you're not a YouTuber, they also have tons of other options to choose from, like callouts and transitions and documentary packs. So there's definitely a plugin that will fit whatever project it is that you're working on. So head to the link in the description, and a huge thank you again to Motion VFX for sponsoring today's video. Now, whenever we're talking about anamorphic lenses or cine lenses in general, I think it's important to talk about the look that these lenses provide. Unlike aspherical lenses where we don't really want distortion or breathing or just general weirdness anywhere, the reason that you go for something like an anamorphic lens is because it gives your image a character or a look that you like for your story. It's sort of hard to discuss these lenses objectively because it's subjective, and it's really hard also not to compare it to something like the Blazar Remus, because I feel like these are the lenses that are affordable that everyone's kind of lusting after these days. So I'm going to do my best, but I will definitely kind of reference these as well. They're different, and they're supposed to be different because they're supposed to give you a different look. In general, I'd say the surprising thing about these lenses is they produce a really nice, clean, pleasing image that gives you a good amount of that classic anamorphic quality without many of the drawbacks. Like, you get this very pleasing waterfall bokeh effect where the bokeh on the edges starts to look a little bit more like a water droplet shape. And those droplets point in different directions based on where in the image they're placed. It gives a little bit of that swirling background effect that a lot of people are looking for, but it does so in a way that's not too overpowering or distracting. It's kind of like a clean version of that. I'm also pretty impressed with the sharpness and contrast, even wide open at T2.9. Often these budget anamorphics have a really great maximum aperture, but they're very soft until you get down to like T4. But with the Laowa Nanomorphs, I found them to be very usable, even all the way through the aperture range. They're certainly sharper in the center, which is always to be expected, but they're pretty usable towards the edges of the frame as well. And on that note, with anamorphics, we often see a ton of distortion on the edges of the frame, which means you need to be very intentional about mostly framing your subject in the center, which is totally fine if that's what your project calls for, but it can be a little bit limiting. With the Laowas, I'm really impressed with how little distortion there is until you get to the very edges of the frame. So if you want to frame an important subject on the rule of thirds, you're definitely able to do so a lot more with these versus something like the Remus. Now, I will say that they do still have a decent amount of pincushion distortion, which you can definitely see here on the edges, which I personally don't prefer. And if I had to give kind of a temperature reading on the filmmaking industry, or at least the ones who complain on the internet, I'd say that pincushion distortion is probably not preferred by most people these days. If that's not your style, I don't think it should be a deal breaker because it's much less aggressive than, say, the Sirui Venus is, and you can always adjust that in post with a little bit of lens distortion. But again, my personal preference is barrel distortion because it kind of makes the image feel a little bit more three-dimensional, like it's coming out at you, whereas pincushion feels like you're kind of being like pulled into the frame. I also kind of feel like that pleasing waterfall bokeh is sort of offset by the distortion, whereas otherwise it could feel like it really helps to create that pop-out look. But again, this is all personal preference, and there are plenty of great and sought-after lenses that completely disagree with this take. So if that's not your take, that's totally fine. As I mentioned, we typically see a lot of compromises when it comes to anamorphic lenses, especially on the more affordable options. One of the most notable and distracting is focus breathing. Now, the Laowas do still have some focus breathing, but it's a lot less pronounced than many of the budget counterparts. So while it's by no means perfect, it is a lot less distracting. But perhaps my biggest struggle with anamorphics is the minimum focus distance. Even the highest end anamorphics are notoriously bad at close focusing, which limits your ability to tell your story without using a diopter. Luckily, with the Laowas, they have a very impressive minimum focusing distance by anamorphic standards. The 32mm can focus at 1 foot 7 inches, while the 42 and 55 can focus at 1 foot 8 inches and 1 foot 10 inches respectively. That's about like 8 to 10 to 14 inches closer than most anamorphics are able to do, which really helped me to get some of these close-up shots. I will note that the 85 minimum focusing distance is 3 feet 3 inches, so much different and an outlier amongst a set, but usually for 85, I don't think you need to get that close. Anyways, just wanted to call that out.
But Cam, what about those sweet anamorphic lens flares?
Again, I opted for the silvers, and I honestly quite like the look that the flares produce. The primary flare is sharp and well-defined, and when you have a smaller light source, the rest of the image retains its contrast very well. However, if you're shooting with something more intense, like the sun, I do think that secondary flaring and ghosting can be a little bit much. The image gets pretty washed out, and there's just a whole lot going on to muddy up the flares in an otherwise pretty clean image. So for me, maybe an extra layer of lens coating could have been nice to subdue those just a little bit. All in all, if I had to put these on a spectrum for budget anamorphics, from clean on one side to character on the other side, I think I'd place them right about here. They have a nice bit of character to give your footage a unique feel and give you some of that anamorphic flavor without going too overboard. And they also do surprisingly well to avoid some of those common pitfalls of anamorphics. Chromatic aberration, soft and lacking contrast, especially wide open, very distorted on the edges, focus breathing, things that some people call flaws, other people call character. Call it what you want, it doesn't really matter. What matters most is that it's choosing the look that fits your personal preferences. So the look you're getting off of these is much different than the look you're getting off of these, and that's totally okay. Just pick the one that you want. With all of this in consideration, I think the price point is pretty on point. Each lens comes in at $1,499 US for a single lens and $53.99 for the 4-lens set. This is obviously a bit pricier than some of the other options out there, but I think it's still within a lot of people's budgets, especially when you consider the quality that you're getting. Are these lenses perfect? No, but no anamorphic lens is. You just have to determine if it's the right lens for what you want. So I am curious to know what you think of these lenses. Is this a look that you like? Do you think you want some? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.